Hello Internet and welcome to this day in history for the 15th of November. Today we go back to 1864 because it was on this day in 1864 that William Tecumseh Sherman, head of the Union forces in Atlanta at this point, but basically the Union forces in the West, started what became known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Having driven the Confederate forces back from the Tennessee border and down deep into Georgia, finally taking Atlanta, he had decided that the best thing he could do with his forces was to destroy the South's ability to supply their armies rather than destroy said armies. While he and Grant otherwise agreed that destroying armies was a better thing than taking cities, he felt like the armies would be destroyed insofar as he destroyed their ability to feed themselves and supply themselves, and that was a lot of uses of the word destroyed in a very short time span. He sent half of his forces back to Tennessee to protect against the remaining Confederate armies now under John Bell Hood, which was later destroyed at the battles of Franklin and Nashville, and he himself led his remaining forces into Georgia, aiming to arrive on the coastline somewhere around Savannah, plundering and destroying everything he came across in the meantime. Of this he was in fact so successful that his threat or brag that he was going to make Georgia howl in fact created such a cacophony that even Jefferson Davis, who at this point had a lot of other things to worry about, such as the fact that Ulysses S. Grant was besieging him in his capital with the Army of the Potomac up in the north, had to send extra commanders down south with the order to raise enough forces to stop Sherman one way or the other, because even he could simply not accept this kind of public outcry. Sherman eventually arrived at Savannah in around December and finally took the city around Christmas, basically finally destroying any hope of the Confederates in the South and the West, and with Grant ever tightening the screws on General Lee up at Richmond and Petersburg. From this moment on, it was really just a matter of time before the Confederacy was finished. Up until November of that year, they have had a pretty good chance of maybe surviving in a diminished state on a negotiated, settled peace, since Lincoln's war policies were not really all that popular in the North around this time, as the war had been dragging on, and defeat had followed defeat before finally some victories in 1863 had once again been followed by what seemed to be a stalemate, as the armies in Georgia were dancing around each other, and Ulysses S. Grant spent many lives during the overland and wilderness campaigns of early autumn 1864. However, with the fall of Atlanta and the beginning of the siege around Richmond, Lincoln was re-elected, and the last hope of the Confederate for a negotiated settlement had vanished. Their only chance now was for a military victory, and with the destruction of Hood's army and the ravaging of the landscape at Georgia and the naval blockade of the Confederate harbors, which meant that the Confederacy at this point basically ended up being cut into three, meant that it was the beginning of the end, and of course only 4 months later the war was in fact over. Grant had originally not been too happy about sending Sherman out on his little walk, but eventually allowed himself to be convinced that George Thomas in Nashville had enough forces to deal with Hood, and that the damage Sherman could do to the public spirit and the supply situation of the South was worth the march to the sea, and so he accepted that, and as I said, on this day in 1864, Sherman and his troops set out on that particular march with the sole purpose of, as I already mentioned, according to him, make Georgia howl. There is, of course, a great deal of modern-day controversy about Sherman's march to the sea in the South. It is, at least many places, seen as what is basically a terrorist movement, which is a direct attack on the civilian population, and there is some degree of truth in that, but there is very little doubt one way or the other that it was a significant and one-of-a-kind military achievement of a degree that you didn't see much in the mid-19th century. So yes, this day in history for the 15th of November. William Tecumseh Sherman begins his march to the sea. I hope this has been of interest to you. Until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.